Ladies and gentlemen, the Kids in the Room podcast.
Kids in the Room podcast.
That's right. That's right.
Brought to you by Moo Faces TV.
Woo! All right. Hey guys, welcome to the Kids in the Room podcast. Today we've got Caitlyn Lubas on the actual podcast. I hope I didn't butcher your name, but welcome to the show. Tell us who you are. Tell us what you're good at. Tell us your specialty. Yeah.
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much for having me. My name is Caitlyn Lubas. I am a recently published author. I wrote a book called You Are Where You Go, all about how I've traveled to 70 countries and all 7 continents by the age of 22, all while I was in college. That is one big part of my life, is kind of like the traveler, the writer. Yeah, that's mostly what I'm here to talk about today.
Wow, crazy, amazing stuff. Yeah, thanks again for definitely coming on. Definitely want to sit down and talk to you and find out, more about your book and your travels. So yeah, let's walk us through, how you kind of got here and, what kind of inspired you to, travel the world to 70 countries. Yeah. And walk us through that process. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So I think for me, my love of travel definitely stemmed from an early age. I kind of grew up with all these stories in my head from my dad, who had traveled probably more than the average kid, especially back in the day when travel was a little more inaccessible. My dad had gone to like Morocco and Acapulco and all these like places I'd never even heard of as a kid. And he was telling me stories about how he was like eating monkey brain in Morocco and like diving off of cliffs and meeting people from all over the world. And I just thought that sounded so cool. Like I really wanted to go out and be just like him and do all of these things. So I had it in my head whenever I was little that I really wanted to travel a lot and as much as possible. And then as I was kind of going through high school, learning about different college opportunities and doing research and stuff, I kind of discovered like, okay, study abroad, that is a really cool concept. I get to not only just kind of be doing my normal school stuff, but I can do it in a different country and I can have the flexibility to travel as much as possible, kind of doing short weekend trips all over the place. That sounds amazing. So I had it in my head when I was applying to colleges that I wanted to go to a place that would let me have as many study abroad opportunities as possible. And for me, with all the way things worked out, I ended up at NYU, which is definitely a school that prioritizes global experiences. They have like a ton of different global campuses in like 13 different countries. So I was able to study abroad 6 times across 5 different continents, which is definitely a really unique experience. I think kind of packing all of that travel into a very young person's brain is a really impactful thing. And that's kind of like the main thing I've learned is I would love to encourage as many people as possible to really prioritize traveling while they're young. And you can like have all those learnings to take with you throughout the rest of your life, like not just kind of being like, oh, I'll travel when I retire. Like that's waiting too long, in my firm opinion.
And why do you feel that? Like, why do you think it's too long, to travel at a later age versus while you're young? What is the variance for you?
I think it's kind of the same concept of like, why do we go to school when we're young? We go to school when we're young so we can learn the lessons and the values and kind of like the skills that we need to equip us for the rest of life. I see travel as a really powerful tool for personal development and learning and growing. So kind of by that same mentality, like why would you not also want to travel earlier in life rather than later in life to kind of front load your learning experience with all these opportunities to discover new cultures, discover new things about yourself, kind of discover new values and ways of seeing the world that you can carry with you through the rest of your life. And I think even beyond that, just the pure fact that if you wait till you retire, you're going to be like in your 60s, you probably can't do a lot of the adventurous travel, like activities that you would likely be doing if you were in your 20s. Like I probably wouldn't be climbing like Kilimanjaro or Mount Everest Base Camp if I was in my 60s, but that is something I would venture to do if I was in my 20s.
Yeah, I agree. I could see that. It might be hard to climb up, the Sphinx or one of those big pyramids or something like that. Yeah. Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah. It's totally crazy. But so you started traveling around the world. How did you do this? Like you were a foreign exchange student. Like, can you walk us through the process of this? Like, how does one do something like this, or how did you do it? Right?
Yeah, for sure. So I think probably most schools nowadays have some sort of connection to like study abroad programs, whether it's kind of hosted in-house. Like for my university, I did my first semester away from my home campus actually at NYU Florence. So we have like the New York City campus of NYU, but then there's also exact same like curriculum, exact same Wi-Fi password, very seamless transition to go to the campus that exists in Florence, Italy. So that was my first experience going abroad. Kind of made it really simple to transition from just a student in New York to a student in Italy. And that really opened my eyes to the fact that it's not scary to do. It's actually a really great opportunity to kind of challenge yourself to get comfortable where you're not necessarily in your comfort zone. And then after that first semester, I also did an exchange student program, which is something that I think if your school doesn't have these kind of school branded study abroad sites, you can definitely look into ways to just be an exchange student or do a study abroad semester at like a partner school. So that's what I did the second time I went abroad. I was an exchange student at the National University of Singapore. So that was a very different experience, not as seamless, definitely was not doing the same exact classes, not with the same exact grading system, but that was kind of the fun of it. I really got to experience what it's like to go to school in a very different country, very different school system, very different just setup of pretty much everything. And I think that's one of the things I loved about it is really seeing those differences. And then even beyond like your typical study abroad or exchange semester, there's so many programs nowadays that will let you go abroad for, let's say, like your winter break, your summer break, doing some sort of like fellowship or like group trip portion of learning. So I did, for example, like a fellowship in Tel Aviv where I basically applied to this thing online, got in a bunch of like, I think like 80 students from different colleges all over the US and all over the world, kind of all coming together for like 6 weeks in Tel Aviv to theoretically learn about coding and entrepreneurship, but in a broader sense, just to like be experiencing living in Tel Aviv for 6 weeks. That's like one example. There's tons of programs like that out there. You can even do like shorter term, like we called them short-term immersions at my school, where you might take like one class that also involves a trip abroad for spring break to go learn deeper about whatever you're talking about in that class. So for example, my first time actually going abroad in college was going to Ghana as part of this social entrepreneurship class that I took. And we were learning about kind of developing countries, nonprofits, social impact, and social entrepreneurship. And we got to kind of apply all the things we were learning by actually traveling to Ghana, working with a village, working with a nonprofit on the ground there, and just really putting all that learning into action was a great example of one of the ways I think travel is just so important. And being able to apply things you're learning in a different context just makes you actually absorb it so much more than just like reading about it in a book.
Right. I totally get it. Yeah. Context is everything. So, yeah, I get it. Yeah. So, what was like your most favorite place and, or places and why?
That is a really tough question, and I get it all the time. So I feel like I've talked through my answers so many times, but I still like can never quite decide. I would say for sure one of the places I recommend the most to anyone who kind of wants a taste of everything on a trip is Argentina. You can fly into Buenos Aires, get a huge look at one of the coolest cities in the world, I think, has so much history, has so many different neighborhoods that all have very distinct characteristics, and get some of the best food you'll probably ever eat, like empanadas, amazing steaks, amazing, just unique things that I haven't had in other countries. Love the food scene, love the history scene. Buenos Aires, amazing. And then you're still able to go see like the biggest waterfalls in the world up on the border of Argentina and Brazil. Then you could fly down to like the southern tip of Argentina and see Patagonia and all of these amazing unique like glacial structures. You can even see penguins if you go to the way southern tip of Argentina, and getting to see all of that in one country, like theoretically in like a 1 to 2 week trip, is probably the best kind of full package I could recommend someone. But beyond that, I also think for some reason I'm very drawn to like glacial landscapes. So I really loved going to Antarctica, Iceland, and Alaska if I had to like also stick those up there somewhere.
Wow, that's crazy. Yeah, definitely sounds like you've been through a solid journey and explored the world. And you mentioned also about Buenos Aires and Argentina in general, and you said it being more of a diverse place. What was so diverse about Argentina, and what were some of the highlights of that?
Yeah, I think definitely diverse in terms of landscape. Like, I had never been on a trip previously where I was sweating in like the city, then also getting to see waterfalls and a rainforest type of environment, but then also getting to see glaciers and mountains, and seeing all of that in one country was definitely an awesome experience, just to like have so many varied experiences all at once. But then even beyond the diversity in the landscapes, I really loved learning more about the history of Argentina and how it really has a very similar like immigrant and like melting pot culture to the US, because I think the majority of the world kind of thinks of the US as this giant melting pot, but there are so many different like immigrant groups that kind of make up the key social fabric of Argentina, and like the history that kind of made Buenos Aires the amazing place that it is, with like people coming from Italy, and there's like a very strong Italian influence in the culture. That's like not something I previously realized, thinking that most of South America is more like influenced by Spain, for example. I thought there was just like so much to uncover there that I thoroughly enjoyed every second of that trip.
Yeah, there is a lot of history there. I mean, there's a lot of history there. And you did touch upon, a lot of the historical history as far as like the immigration and things like that. And a lot of people probably don't know this, but from what I remember reading about Argentina or even South America's history is that, and definitely about, a lot of the immigration from Italy and things like that is at a period of time, from what I remember, is like South America in general. It kind of had how would you say? It had a situation where, the countries, as you would say, I mean, because these were countries that were, colonialized just like the United States was, and it started getting a little bit browner than what it was.
Mm-hmm.
And so what was done is some of these countries ended up opening up immigration to certain European countries to lighten it up after a while. This is kind of what happens in colonialism in history, and so a lot of the countries where things were happening as far as like poverty and people who wanted to look for new ways or whatever reason you might want to leave your home mother country. There could be tons of reasons, right? A new fresh start, whatever, right? A lot of people went from Italy to actually Argentina, which is why there's also a large Italian influence, right? But then you also have that in Brazil too. A lot of different places in South America, but definitely Argentina is probably one of the biggest ones. There's also a large Armenian influence inside of Argentina as well, which a lot of people really don't know. There's a lot of Armenians there. Probably the second place is probably LA in that region, but other than that, there are a lot of Armenians there, and there's also a lot of rumors of a lot of Germans, and well, it's a fact there's Germans there, and there's a lot of I would say there's a lot of Nazis that escaped there. Some of them are probably not alive,
Yeah,
some of them
I
are
heard
probably
that
dead.
as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's a history where they say, Hitler, he escaped on a U-boat and, either traveled and landed in Brazil or traveled in Argentina. There were a lot of like different, base camps that were kind of set up in those two countries. Well, in those countries in general, or other ones within that region. And it's like there's a whole bunch of diverse history when you start talking about Latin America in general, because it was made by diversity. But it's kind of hard to see at some point who's who after such a period of time. But I feel like Argentina has such a new influx of immigration within the past 50 to 60 years to where you can kind of see a little bit where most people are kind of originated from. But eventually it will melt and blend in like most of Latin America is, where you're not going to be able to tell who has what and who has this and etc. You look at people like Adriana Lima, who has like, I think she has like German, Dutch, African, indigenous Americas and Native American, whatever you want to call it. She has that in her ancestry, and probably a couple other things that she might have not even mentioned or even dug in to find out. And obviously some Asian too as well, because there's a lot of Japanese in Brazil. So it's like this keeps on changing and exchanging and changing and growing as we start going to countries like Latin America. But I feel like the variance is, and differ from the Americas, is America I feel like is more segregated than Latin America is when
Mm-hmm.
it comes to intermixing or mixing with different cultures, right? It's still like, yeah, we're diverse, but we're still like this. America has like still this taboo is like, oh, I want to stick with, what culture or ethnicity do I want to blend in more with? Even though I might have a mixed ancestry, I might want to go more towards the European side. And so now we don't really see that other side, or I might want to go towards more the African side or whatever side you may feel that might fit in, or indigenous side, whatever it may be. This is kind of how United States works, and I feel like it's more segregated because of these old caste-like principles than you see in Latin America or even the Middle East in general, where it's just like everybody just kind of accepts you mostly for what you are, even though there are still some biases that do exist. Don't get me wrong, they exist. It's just still like a welcoming melting pot, and it's interesting. I know I had one friend who actually he was from Argentina, and like he had a bunch of businesses here, pretty much started off from his dad. But I never forget that one time we were talking Spanish and stuff like that, and then all of a sudden his father, who I was kind of, he started speaking some other languages on the phone, and I was just like, dude, what is he speaking? And he was speaking German. And
Wow.
I don't know who he was talking to, but he was definitely speaking German. And I was just like, why is your father speaking in German? And like, he's always walking outside, and he's always secretive. And I always like thought that was weird, but you never know. But he was from Argentina, but it was just like weird. Why is he speaking, German, and he's from Argentina, and he'd always walk outside, and was just a really secretive guy, and had like businesses all around. It was just really interesting. Who was his father? But his father sadly passed away. A good guy though, but. Other than that, I think it's always interesting. But I think that's interesting what you just mentioned in general, how history just kind of like overlaps, and it just keeps on consistently changing. And if you look at it, if you look at variant times within these Americas or the lands in general, how much it's actually changed. And you go there and you get to see these different types of history, and how the evolution of people have kind of like influenced the culture or the current landscape. Like you wouldn't even recognize it after a certain period of time. You wouldn't recognize America as being mostly Native Americans in general, and all the Americas in general. You just wouldn't recognize that if you saw that about 400 to 500 years ago. It's just like a whole different type of place, and it's just amazing how time can totally change your perception of a place and add culture from different backgrounds and influence that. It's amazing. Yeah. So
Yeah, no, that's really real.
yeah, it is. I mean, so I guess a little bit of, enough off of that. I just want to dig in and talk about that. But what were some of the craziest things and, weirdest things that you saw on your travels?
Yeah, so I think one experience that definitely was one of my biggest sources of like culture shock and just experiencing it for the first time was when I spent a few weeks in the UAE, specifically like Abu Dhabi and Dubai, and mostly in Abu Dhabi where they don't necessarily get as many tourists as Dubai, having people just like look at you and wanting or expecting you to be like wearing
A hijab or something?
like something to cover your hair.
Right.
Sorry?
A hijab.
Yeah. Or just like having to always dress in like long flowing pants. Like that was something that I just wasn't prepared for necessarily. Like I'd had to do it when I went to different like churches in Europe or like temples in Southeast Asia, but I think just going to the mall and having to be pretty covered up, or like people expecting it to be that way, was something that definitely was a big culture shock to me. And just like learning the different reasons behind that. Like one of the things that I had always considered was that, oh, like that's a kind of like sad that women have to be covered up, and that's just like the way society is. But when I talked to some women who were kind of like giving us a tour around Abu Dhabi, they were explaining like, oh, we don't see it as like a lack of empowerment at all. We actually like enjoy the fact that we are covering ourselves up and we're not being like forced to sexualize ourselves in the way that like society wants us to. And I had just never really thought of it from that perspective. I think growing up in America, you get very ingrained with this like, yeah, women who dress however they want, they're like empowered women. They can do what they want. Like if you want to sexualize yourself, do it. But then on the flip side, it's like maybe that actually is a very valid perspective to be of the opinion that if I am covering myself up, I don't need to like show off my beauty or like appeal to societal standards. So I just thought that that was definitely one perspective that has always stuck with me, that even something that I consider to be like one way of like, this is good for women's rights or this is bad for women's rights, is something that can be perceived completely differently.
Yeah, that's deep. I mean, I totally get what you're saying. It makes sense. And it is like, it's something I've always had conversations with people before, is like, what is relative and what is our perception? Our perception is, hey, look, we feel like our way is right and our type of indoctrination is just like the right way to kind of pronounce, or our ideology in general is the way that everything is. And I think that comes from our arrogance, being a part of the Western world or being one of the dominant nations in the world. Is we kind of push this type of like, our ideas are the way it should be and everything else is irrelevant or cave-like. And what's funny about that is like, a lot of these places were big places, or I don't know if I want to say just big places. These were, center stages of the world at one time. Every given country or area or region had one massive, control over the world, or, was a massive, I guess, how do I want to say it? A massive, I don't want to say decision maker, but empire in general. These were empires that were just as big as the United States in their heyday. And it's like, now they may not be, but they were. If we start thinking about Rome, and Greece and et cetera, how that all connected, that was like the center stage of, of Europe at the time, right? Anything past that was, at a certain period of time, was considered, anybody else were barbarians, right? They weren't considered civilized. Mm-hmm. Like, the Romans didn't consider most of Europe civilized people. They actually gave them tag names as like barbarians. And so it's like, that sounds crazy now, because when you start thinking about the Western world, where does the dominance lie, and where does most of the philosophy of technology being the supreme or the highest thought of coming from? It's actually thought of typically coming from Europe, or either Asia or Russia. These are typically where we kind of stereotype, where these dominant cultures or empires kind of exist in our times. But if we go back, there were different times in different countries and places and regions where it was totally not that. They weren't even existing. They weren't even the top guy at that time. So it's like Egypt. Egypt was a place, and Alexandria was a place where people are still trying to figure out, like, dude, what the hell were they doing over there? Like, how the fuck did they do any of that shit? Like, it was, we have to dumb it down and say, well, it couldn't have been those Africans. It had to be the aliens. It had to be these aliens with these big heads that just came down and had to teach them that, because we don't know how to do that. So therefore, it couldn't have been them. But see, that's where our arrogance of where we think we are, and that we were the dominant empire at our time, and that there were none but prior, right? And so this is where that arrogance comes from. But it doesn't necessarily. Basically, what I'm saying is, you don't have to be the first to be the current winner, right? History is written by its victors. So if you're the winner at that time, you can rewrite history as how you want it and teach everybody, hey, I'm literally the greatest. I'm the greatest. We're the greatest, and anybody else never did it like we did it. And so that's just pretty much what it is. So what I've seen typically is each different empire kind of like, they push this like propaganda that they were the best of their time. And it's like, if you keep on looking back throughout history and regions, anywhere you go around the world predominantly, you'll find some dominant, culture or empire that was highly technologically ahead. And you might have seen some people or cultures that might have not been the winners of that time, but now may be. So it's like, it keeps on fluctuating. So it's like, how do you look at people and think that your way is the best way, or, or everyone else is more primitive? Because it's, hey, Rome thought, most of Europe was primitive compared to who they were, They didn't think much of it, And, they idolized Egypt, and there was Alexandria, and they were going there burning books, and all kinds of stuff was happening. There's just a crazy amount of history, and gunpowder, that was pretty much came from Asia, and they used that to they used that to, use guns, right? To make guns, right? They used the gunpowder, and that was used to make guns, and now, what happens to that, and etc. But each civilization has like these like prime times or these special moments where they're just like, it seems like their technology or they're on top of the world and they're just at winners at that time. But it keeps on changing. In America, we're still young. We're still young. We're still on top. In the Western world, we say, hey, we know the best, but we don't know, man. I think it's just interesting. So I think that's where I kind of wanted to touch back and bring up that conversation of how you were saying about what's relative or not. And that's where I wanted to circle back, because I totally agree with you on that. It is relative. But now that we're talking about that in general, what were some of the things that you kind of, you taste that might have been different for you? And when I say weird, again, I want to focus on that and say, I don't mean necessarily weird, like to someone else. It is relative. But I think what I'm saying is like weird to us, right? Based off of how we grew up and what we're told is great, right? We think it's great because we were told it's great, and that's our behavior and our experiences we've learned, so we say it's great. So what is typically weird is relative to us, yes. So what I'm saying is, what was weird for you? Because if that wasn't relative to you, you know what I mean? You know what I'm saying? So
Yeah, for sure.
like as far as like foods,
that I've seen over
like,
the past few years.
Yeah, like foods you taste and things like that. Like what did you think would taste very odd to you, considering how you've typically have a palate to eat it from? Sorry.
Yeah, I think one thing that comes to mind for sure is in Peru and Ecuador, there's guinea pig is like a specialty to eat. And growing up in the US, you think guinea pigs are pets. They are not anywhere near something you'd find on like a dinner plate. That was one thing that was definitely just like surprising. Like I actually have a friend who did like a work away type of thing where she was working on a guinea pig farm in Peru. So that was one that I think the average Westerner would probably consider pretty weird. Another one that definitely comes to mind is I was in Cambodia and we were looking for kind of like interesting, unique, local spots to eat at, and there was this place called the Bugs Cafe where we had like deep fried tarantula or like a wok with silkworms in it or like egg rolls with ants in it. And not to say that that's typical Cambodian food, because that's definitely not true, but just the fact that that even existed is definitely something I found weird. It is an experience I'll never forget, like put a cricket in my mouth and just literally not being able to swallow it.
Yeah, that definitely sounds weird. I mean, I've also seen like, some countries have like chocolate covered like scorpions and things like that and ants. And like, did you experience any of that?
I mean, pretty much like on all the street markets and things, that's where you get like the really good local food. If you can ever go to like a night market where they just have stalls in the street, highly recommend that to try to really see what the local foods is like. Definitely a ton of like scorpions on skewers all throughout Southeast Asia. If you go up to like Taiwan, saw like chicken butt, chicken feet, like things that just eat in Western culture, but it is perfectly normal and like actually very desirable to eat those things in like most East Asian cultures. So just actually seeing all that firsthand and seeing people really excited about things that sound disgusting, like stinky tofu is this like specialty in Taiwan, and I could not even wrap my head around like, why would you want to eat something that's called stinky? Like it smells bad, it's not appealing, but you learn to understand just the way that people find different things appealing, and that's like there's no right or wrong for sure, but it's just different.
No, that's totally interesting. Stinky, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, why would you want to eat? I don't know. There's been some things I think even in America where you've eaten some things and it probably stinked originally. I mean, fish kind of stinks, right? A lot of it, but then it tastes really good depending on your palate. Yeah. So I mean, you're overseas. You're traveling. How was it like for you? Like, were people really helpful for you? Like how were the cultures, when it came to interacting with people versus how you were used to as the norms of, America or United States? How was that?
I think it varies place to place. One example definitely comes to mind. Like, I feel like people in the UK are just so friendly and so polite. Like, I know this probably would never, ever happen in New York, but when I first to the UK, like on my way to go study abroad in Florence, I was like struggling through the underground system to like get on the trains, and had 2 huge suitcases with me because I was basically moving to Italy for 5 months. And I'm just like this small girl with these huge bags, clearly struggling to get down the stairs. And so many people like stopped and helped me and like carried my bags for me. And like one guy even was like, "Oh, like you're just a small like girl, like here, I'll buy you like dinner at the train station, like from this stand." I'm just like, this would never happen in New York. People would be going about their day, just like walking as fast as possible. Definitely a very unique experience of just experiencing the kindness of strangers and people just wanting to know, like, oh, like, why do you have all these bags? Like, are you moving? Like, people being friendly and just striking up a conversation is definitely very opposite from the culture I've experienced in New York, where, like, I have struggled for sure on the New York City subway with large bags, and people just kind of go about their day and maybe even, like, get angry at you for blocking their way.
I mean, could it be also New York is a place where it has all this culture, but at the same time, there's a lot of like, I don't know, there's no empathy, right? People are really desensitized because it's more like a dog eat world. You know, it's like, hey, either eat or be eaten, right? I mean, is that probably the reason why it's like that? What do you think?
I think New York does have this culture of like most people move to New York or live in New York for some sort of like advancement goal. Like you're trying to like get to the next level of your career, you're working really hard. Like that hustle culture is super present in New York. And I think that also there's just so many people in New York. You get really used to the fact that there are at any given moment like hundreds of other people in your immediate vicinity who are like going about their own lives. You can't really get too preoccupied with other people around you. A lot of people just tend to like focus on their own path, their own self. I definitely have experienced that and noticed that in the past couple of years that I've spent in New York. But you'll get like a friendly New Yorker every here and there, but it's definitely less common to even have like someone make eye contact and smile with you on the street in New York than it would be in pretty much any other city that I've experienced.
No, totally. And you've also lived like in Silicon Valley, correct? I think we touched on that, or?
Yeah, so I spent some time living in the Bay Area, in San Francisco itself, as well as around, spent some time in LA, San Diego, kind of was like nomadically moving around the US last year. So even just getting those different tastes of different parts of the US definitely provides that contrast to like, okay, the behavior that I used to consider normal in New York maybe isn't even normal in like California or in like Maine or other parts of the country.
Yeah, it totally isn't. Like, what was your experience? Like, how would you compare, New York experience versus your Silicon Valley experience?
I do think that they're both intense and like work oriented in their different ways. I personally like work in tech, so I thought it was like really refreshing to come to a place where there were so many other people with a similar mentality, because that's just not as dominant of a force in New York City. I feel like New York, you got more of like finance, fashion. Those are like the typical industries you'd come across people. But pretty much everyone I met when I was living in Silicon Valley, like even just like talking to someone on like the bus or something, they'd be like, "Oh, so like where do you work?" And like probably 50% of the time you'd hear like Facebook, Apple, Google. That is just something I never experienced. I didn't know anyone who worked in those companies or that industry growing up on the East Coast. So for me, that was like refreshing and cool to be around like-minded people. But after a certain point, it hits that tipping point where, okay, maybe this isn't the greatest thing anymore. Like I actually am like craving some of that diversity. So I think New York has so many different people in it. I do love that about it. And there's definitely culture from everywhere. Whereas in a positive way, I think the Bay Area has a ton of like Asian influence, which was actually also really refreshing for me because I am half Filipino and there are so many Filipinos in the Bay Area. I was like overjoyed to see so many like food options and just like people who looked like me when I first came there.
Yeah, that's so true. And I think you touched on a lot of things because you said you're originally from like the East Coast, like New York area. Is that correct? Or yeah,
Yeah, I grew up in New Jersey.
awesome. Yeah, so I was born in Connecticut, so I totally get the vibes of that. I've lived all around the coast of United States, both east, west, and I get it. I get it. And like This is something that I always hear, since I've been living in Silicon Valley for a while, and in tech. And it's like, a lot of people will say like, I love it here because it's so diverse. And I'm just like, what? I mean, I love it here, but it's like, it's not that diverse. Like, I guess it's relative to what you consider diverse. I did grow up every other weekend or so in New York. My dad, family predominantly lived around that region, and some other places, but predominantly New York. So I used to go to Queens and stuff like that all the time, or Long Island. And so when people say diverse, and then when you look at people in your family, it's like, diverse? What do you mean diverse? Like, I don't see diversity here. I feel like, when I'm walking to a lot of the companies and, I'm looking around, I'm like, this is not diversity. It just feels like there's just like 3 or 4 dominant cultures that, exist here. Like when I walk into your house and I see like 5 different people and you can't tell exactly where they're all from, but they're all relatives, that's diversity to me. And they might all speak different languages. That is diversity. But like when it's like 2 or 3 dominant cultures in a place that you typically don't see in the United States, that doesn't mean diverse, right? Because you could be in the South and say that it's diverse if if that's what you're looking for, right? It could be this variance of what's relative to you, but technically a lot of people probably in the South might not consider it very diverse because there's 2 dominant cultures that pretty much exist within that region. And likewise, I would say here in Silicon Valley, there's about roughly 3. Yeah, in my neighborhood, majority everybody in my neighborhood here in Silicon Valley are mostly Filipinos, pretty well off Filipinos that, might have got some early tech money or still some recent tech money. So that's majority everybody in my neighborhood for the most part. And you won't typically find that in some places in the East Coast, but I feel like here I can easily find that. I can easily go into a bar and have majority everybody Asian or most of my friends Asian, where it's like East Coast, all the Asians are probably my friends. That's literally, that's how small it is, the diversity. Typically, when you go to places, you have to go to regions. And when you start talking about New York and stuff, you have to go to certain areas a lot of times, to actually, touch a lot of different cultures and ethnicities. But I would say more in Queens, there's so much like diversity there that's easier to interact with so many different people in general. And I think they did there was this like a test of like the most genetically diverse place in the world, and it was Queens, New York. Some scientists did that. Yeah, because they wanted to track back the human genome or something like that, and that was where they did it at. But I definitely understood that, so that's what I consider pretty darn diverse. But even there's still some limitations to that. But I don't know. It's interesting how the Bay thinks, and I think that influences. And I don't know if you feel this. This influences the culture and the vibe and the energy of how these different regions or areas are, when it comes to just thinking in general of how you do things.
Yeah, it's all really relative for sure. Like, I think me growing up in like a pretty white suburb outside of New York City, feeling like I was the only Asian, like whenever I see like groups of other like Asian people, specifically Filipinos, that to me seems so diverse. But to someone who like grows up in the Bay Area where that is the norm, they'd probably think the complete opposite of like, oh, this is just average, It's very interesting to think about the environment that you grew up in and what you grow to consider normal really does influence your perspective kind of moving forward in life.
No, and I agree with you totally. But the funny part is what you just mentioned is normally when I sit there and I sit down with my friends or I'm talking to any company or something like that, typically most of my friends here that live in the Bay Area, they're always like promoting like, hey, the Bay Area is so cool because it's like so diverse. I normally don't typically hear them say that it's the other, right? It's not the latter. It's usually, it is diverse. They're claiming diversity, even though I feel like, since we grew up on the East Coast, we probably consider that more diverse than probably here. But I haven't heard them actually say the opposite way, like it hasn't been very diverse. I actually hear it very different. And so when you start talking about inclusion, diversity in a lot of the tech companies, it's like, well, how can that possibly be when the statistics and the numbers here don't actually equal to that? It's almost impossible to have that. I don't want to say impossible, but it's harder to have those exact inclusion diversity numbers to make it very diverse when you start talking about ethnicity and culture. Of course, there's a male versus female or transgender or whatever it may be, that type of diversity that exists. But like the other, and even that's still small. But the other, I find like it's really hard to gravitate on here. And I don't know, that's interesting. I love New York. I love all these different places. And even I would say Miami's another version, right? Of another, small country, or only like two or three different, cultures that are dominant in that region. And you can kind of just get that whole flavor. It's kind of like, Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is very, Asian influence, but then, Miami's very Spanish speaking influence. So you just get like this total different demographics or vibe or energy. You feel like you're in Colombia, or you're in Latin America in general. It's very interesting, and I love it too. But I love the diversity here. But what I wanted to ask you too as well, because I mean, you grew up kind of similar to me, typically in a mostly all white neighborhood for the most part, and that is I wonder if you, because you mentioned kind of you noticed it in certain ways. Did that play like some type of like I don't know, influence, or did that do something to you internally? Like, were there any like issues when you were growing up, or like how was that experience for you?
Yeah, so I think it was a very interesting experience for me because I am half Filipino and half Polish. So like when I was growing up, I didn't really like understand what that meant to be like not white, but also non-Asian. And I think that played itself out just like whenever I had to go like check off on like a standardized test, like, oh, are you white or are you Asian? I think instinctively, since I saw so many of my peers were white, I used to be like, oh, well, my dad is white, so I'm white too, even though like I really don't look like the typical like white person in appearance. I think that for the longest time, I never really understood how unique that was to be a mixed race person in a predominantly white community, because like you could lean one way, but that's actually not how you appear to people. And like I had so many instances where like people would come up to me and like just kids being dumb kids, whatever. But I was like at a soccer practice one time and someone came up to me after I like went to my dad sitting on the sidelines and they were like, oh, are you adopted? Because you don't look like your dad. And just like things like that, I don't think I ever truly like processed when I was little, but it just like made me super confused. And I think as I traveled more, I kind of learned how mixed race is also perceived like even differently in other countries just because it's not as common. I think that in itself has just been a very unique perspective that I've had like throughout my life.
That is interesting. And I also wanted to add there, what you kind of mentioned on it's not as common. I think that really also depends on the region of where you're saying that at. So, for example, in Latin America, that is very common. It's really hard to point out what somebody exactly is. You can claim that you're this and that, but when you do a DNA test or when you look at relatives and different people, everybody looks a little bit different than what you might think, and it's really just like this. It's ambiguous, and then you just come to the United States and everybody just says, you're a Spanish speaker or you're from this country. It's all about your nationality, even though these countries or nations didn't really exist, prior, maybe like even 100 or even 500 years ago, they didn't exist. They're all now created, right? It's just interesting how people have different perspective, but I feel it's more perceived as not a big thing there than it is in places that kind of have like a dominant, let me say, historical visual look or phenotype, right? You go to Europe, there's a dominant phenotype that's in that region. You go predominantly to Africa, there's a dominant phenotype within those regions. Even though it's ranges so much, there's so much diversity within Africa, and we kind of have these stereotypes, but there's still like a dominant phenotype in general. And even when you go to some places in Asia, there's dominant phenotypes when you go towards Northern Asia versus when you start going down to Southern Asia, it starts getting really diverse. And then it also brings me to the whole thing of this. Even when we're talking about, growing up Filipino and things like that, or part Filipino, or half Filipino, or et cetera. But then you start wondering, when we start thinking about even representing those things, it's like, then at some point, what is Filipino? Because then, the Philippines was, colonized, from my understanding of all history, by the Spanish and maybe some other people. The French also probably came in there. And I think they went into Vietnam too as well. So it's like, who's like, what is Filipino at some point? So it's like, how much of this equals this, and how much of that is that? So could you actually be half of this or half that? Then you have different people that exist on the islands. You have like Negritos, who typically don't look like all of the stereotypical Asian phenotype. There's people like from Fiji. There's, all these different types of phenotypes that exist within Asia that don't typically fit the stereotype of quote unquote Asian, right? But technically they are Asian. Right? It's
That's
like,
true.
how does that, so when we think about being Filipino, it's like, it's almost like Latin America where it's just like a melting pot of people. So when you say somebody is half, how are they fucking half? Are they really half? Like, do we know what are they half of? You know what I mean? Like when you start coming from countries that are already mixed ethnicity generationally anyways.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, totally. It's a super interesting just like concept. And I actually was so curious about it. I did one of those like 23andMe tests, and I'm like exactly 49% Eastern European Polish, and then like 49% Filipino, which exactly, like, how can you know what exactly that means?
That makes no sense, because when you judge the history, what exactly is Filipinos? There's like how many islands within the Philippines?
Like 100,000? I don't know.
There's like tons of them. There's like tons of islands there. So it's like who's what and who's when, and how many people have traveled there through thousands of years. But I'm just saying, even during the periods of times within the past 500 years, during it being, this interception or crossing colonialism, or being kind of like invaded and and then blended in, and then even before that, the people that were existing on each island, like, were they all exactly the same phenotype looking people? It's obviously not when you look at a lot of the history. So it's like, what is what and who is what, and then like how much Spanish ancestry do the typical Filipino have, or is there even a typical, right? So then it's like, if they do, like, are they more this, or are they a little bit less of that? But then, even when you do like those 23andMe things, they are, when they start talking about like your percentages, they're not really accurate. They're all just guessed. And obviously, there's no way to say there's somebody who's 49% of Filipino, but they also want to be PC and say, okay, well, we don't want to say that their Filipino isn't really like an exact race, if you will, so we want to say just it's this, right? Versus when you go to Europe, when you say you're European, they mean that predominantly all of your ancestors came and looked like this Pacific phenotype for thousands of years, right? It's very Pacific. But when you start doing that in Philippines, is that the same exact way? Because it's not even actually accurate, if you will. And then also when you add on, these tests like 23andMe, they do these, you also have like genetic recombination. Are you familiar with that? Mm-hmm. So yeah. You might your grandmother might be, let's say she was, I don't know, maybe she was, let's just take a leap and say she was Russian or something like that, and she moved to the Philippines 100 years ago or something like that, your great-great-grandparents or whatever it may be. When you actually think about that, you might not even show up, that DNA might not even show up on your percentage, because genetic recombination skips generations randomly. Mm-hmm. So
yeah, it's crazy.
They're not even that accurate at some point. So when they say like 49% or you're 59%, these are just like, when people start walking around and talk, hey man, I'm 40 or 50. Well, how do you know? Like, and then they only trace, from my understanding, like on your father's side, your paternal line, and then on your mother's side, the maternal line, from my understanding. So then there's like, but what about their maternal? What about your paternal father's maternal side, and et cetera? Like, how does that work when you start digging down there? So there could be obviously a lot of room for error, but I don't know. It's interesting. So yeah, just wanted to go on a rant on that. It was just interesting to me to actually talk about that, because I know you might have dealt with that, but like when you have conversations with people and you're saying you're justifying this, saying I'm really this, it's like, really, do we really even know? So the safest thing is to say, okay, I'm from Philippines. But then if you want to be accurate, what does that really mean? I think that's really what I'm trying to say. But yeah, it's a great thing. So you grew up there. And, I understand like you had like these, you start touching on like how some people might have thought you were adopted and things like that. But is it some point that kids, I don't know, maybe kids are, I don't want to say they're mean, but maybe they're just like kind of ignorant to the facts that we learn these type of things, that you have to look exactly like this person in order to be that person's parent.
Yeah. I think it's just like there's no example that most people have seen where like a kid doesn't look at least the same race as their parents. But I think that's improving nowadays. Like there are mainstream TV shows now that have like mixed families and like kids that don't look like the dad, kids that don't look like the mom. And I think the more representation that gets, it actually does make such a big difference because then a kid will subconsciously see like ads that feature families that are mixed or like movies, TV shows, and it won't be so foreign to them when they see it in real life. I think all of that is definitely moving in a positive direction nowadays.
No, I totally get it, and I agree with you, but I still think it's still far behind because you still see people
Hmm.
in the United States trying to cast people into like these caste systems or these colonialized one drop things like, oh, this person's this percentage Asian or versus this, so they're just Asian. So then it's just like, well, then at what point is this person this versus that? And does it really matter? I mean, even guys like Bruce Lee, he was, his mother was half European. So technically, Bruce Lee was 25% European, right? So it's like, and then he had a son, Brandon Lee and a daughter, and then their mom was European. So, somebody might say, well, they're half Asian, but technically they weren't half Asian, right? Because Bruce Lee was already a quarter European. So do you see where it gets really fuzzy when you start typecasting things and trying to represent, oh, I'm this, I'm that, and trying to stay in these boxes? It just gets really confusing. And I think like in Latin America and in general, they got rid of most of these type of like logic. So it's really just like basically what do you look like more or, but it's not really something that's pressured and pushed onto you in your life. Like you can't do this, you can't do that kind of a thing mostly. I wouldn't say it's for
Right.
every place, but majority, like even Mexico got rid of the idea of race about 100 years ago, right? Before that, there used to be you're this, you're that within Mexico, and they would count up the different degrees of what percentages you were and give them different names in Spanish. Doesn't exist anymore. Now they're just Mexican, so it's based off of nationality. Where in America, we're still saying, hey,
Yeah.
you're this, you're that, and you fit in with more of this, so you're over here. And like, do you know what I mean? Like, how did you? And when I'm asking that question, how did you deal with that? Growing up and now being an adult, like when somebody just, I don't know, because some people want to identify just with one thing versus what they actually genetically are, background of. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's been interesting in the last few years that I've more like consciously thought about it. Like when I got to college, there's like a Polish club and there's like a Filipino club. 'Cause NYU is a really international school. They have tons of kids from all over the place. And I like literally felt like it would be inappropriate to join the Polish club because I don't look Polish and I don't like fit in there, even though half of me and half of my culture and the things like I know how to sing happy birthday in Polish. I love eating Polish food at home, but it just doesn't fit. But then kind of on the flip side, like I go to the Filipino club where I look like I fit in, but I don't speak Tagalog. Like I don't necessarily have the same experience that people who have two Filipino parents have. So I also felt like I didn't really fit in there. And then even like in a broader sense, just especially as I've been traveling, I'll say like, "Oh, I'm from America." And people will be like, "Oh, but like where are you really from?" Because I feel like that's just the question you always get because people from around the world know that like Americans aren't necessarily just like American. Everyone's from somewhere else because it has this reputation of being like a melting pot type of country. So it's always interesting just being like, nope, I was born in America. I'm American. My parents are from here and here, but like I am American. Like, there's no way around that.
I mean, is that technically true throughout, most people's experience or what they're trying to say and communicate towards an individual who doesn't look like what they consider American? Right? Because like I would question that if you look more European typically and you say you're from America or you're American, most people will agree that you're American. But I feel like some cultures are still not visually accepted as you're just American, right? It's just like, well, where are you really from?
Yeah.
Especially if your name sounds a little bit different, and it's just like they're gonna be like, what is that? I'm like, where are you from? Like people are gonna dig if they can't find exactly where you're from, or it's not so obvious. They're gonna ask where are you from. So like, it's just gonna itch on them,
People like having like categories to go and like define things in, and it just like makes more sense in people's brains. But like when you don't squarely fit into one of those categories, it's like Yeah, I don't fit. That's just how it is.
But technically, I mean, but what about this? When everybody's just American, you fit in the American box. But I think like the problem is within the United States, we have caste systems that says, hey, look, this is, morally the dominant person in America, and this is what we consider American. And if you don't look like this, you're pretty much typically not, or you don't fit. Your name sounds different. You're not technically American, right? Like Caitlyn,
Right.
it's a very American name. I would say very Western name. So it's just like, okay, well, that sounds American. But then, they might visually see you and they might say, well, wait, where are you from? Like, where you're from. And it's like, what do you mean by
Right,
where am I
right,
from? And some of that might come from genuine curiosity because they might be trying to, connect with you because maybe they might share some ancestry from there. Or maybe it's just like some type of bigotedness, ignorance that might just be coming out and you're just like, what, dude?
Yeah, totally.
What, dude? Yeah. So I think it's interesting, though, that you've had to, navigate through that and grow up through that. And I don't know, have you been to some cool, Filipino spots out west, T-Logs, or I might be pronouncing that wrong. But yeah, like cool Filipino spots out here?
Yeah, there's a ton of really good Filipino spots in the Bay Area. There's like a food truck / restaurant in SF called Senor Sisig. They kind of do like Filipino burritos. That's a really cool combo. There's just like so many ube flavored things out on the West Coast, which is not as common on the East Coast. And ube is like a super prominent flavor in like Filipino desserts and stuff. So I always love going out west. There's just so much food that resonates with me.
So did you grow up on that, on Filipino style food, or was it mostly just like American food or Polish food?
I would say like my mom cooked like American food in general, but my grandma from my mom's side, like she would always be making Filipino desserts, Filipino pastries, Filipino food, and like I often spent time at my grandma's house when I was young, so definitely grew up eating Filipino food. Like now my grandparents live in my household, so there's like a lot of Filipino, and then there's just my dad who's like non-Filipino, so definitely have been surrounded by the culture, but I don't necessarily like cook Filipino food on my own or like crave it in the way that I think like people who grew up in just a Filipino household probably do.
Yeah, I always kind of say like, almost like the Philippines is like almost like the soul food of Asia. Like the food is just
Yeah.
like really heartwarming and stuff like that. It's like made from the heart. But really awesome people, come next door and always give you food and greet you and just always polite and respectful. So like, heads up for that. Always love different cultures and different people and people who influence the world. It makes us all diverse and it makes us more, I don't know, more knowledgeable, which is why I appreciate you going around, to 70 countries, gathering empathy for different people and backgrounds. But it'd be also cool that you actually, visit Poland and, got in touch with that type of like ancestry and stuff like that, just to, hey, it's a part of who you are. You might be interested in it. It just doesn't matter if you don't look 100% like that. Sometimes we feel like we have to, we feel like, I don't know, maybe we've been sometimes conditioned to say, oh, I don't look like this anymore. So, maybe I won't feel welcome, and I think that could be
Yeah, no,
fair.
like I went to Poland and I told my tour guide like on a walking tour, I was like, "Oh, fun fact, like I'm half Polish." And they basically like laughed at me. They're like, "Oh, you're serious?" Like it's just funny.
Yeah. And it's just like, but it's always just a shock that, it's always good to do that too as well, because then you can, people can, learn more about different diversities and how people look and things like that who have similar backgrounds. And they don't necessarily look 100% like what they consider Poland, but still Polish. So I think it's always good for them to
Totally.
experience that and to learn that. And I think the shock factor for those who don't even get that might, I don't think I'd be shocked if you said that, honestly, me, but maybe I grew up around more diverse people. So I would be like, all right, yeah, cool, I get it, I see, yeah. I can tell
Yeah.
there's something there, but some people, when they're not used to diversity of some sense, or, people with multiple backgrounds, they're kind of just like, box, 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 box. I can't tell what this is, but this goes in this box. It has to
Right.
be in this box because there's these vague phenotypes that they're just looking for as far as signals, and that's just kind of how they work. And it's kind of like how some people say, "Oh, this person looks just like that person looks just like Chris Rock because he has the same hairstyle." And they're just like, "Yeah, he looks like Chris Rock. He has the same color and he has the same hairstyle." And you're like, "Dude, he doesn't look like Chris Rock." Or that guy looks like The Rock, or he looks like Vin Diesel. He does? Why? Because he has a similar complexion and he has a bald head. I don't know. Like,
Yeah, all these like visual shortcuts are pretty faulty sometimes.
yeah, but I also contribute that to people. Not everybody's visual. You know, not everybody's visual, and and I think what you said earlier, they might not culturally associate with those type of people as much, so they kind of just like stick things into their own box. But I get it. So right now, you said you're also, to change the subject a little bit, you're in tech. What are you doing in tech? That's amazing that you're doing that in
Sorry.
tech. I'm so like, that's awesome.
Yeah, I'm just coughing in tech. No, yeah,
Where do I get that
spent the past
job?
2 years. I spent the past 2 years working at Instagram and TikTok, kind of just exploring like ways to
Wait,
create products
hold
that
on.
are super
Back up for a
impactful.
second. I'm so sorry, Caitlyn.
Yeah,
You said you spent the past 2 years working at TikTok and Instagram?
yeah.
Like, what do you mean? You're working as like a product designer? What are you, an engineer? What are you doing? Like, and are you an intern, or are you just FTE, or you contract? Like, what do you like? How did you? Yeah, tell us about this.
Yeah. I worked full time at Instagram for my first year out of college, and then switched over to TikTok. I work in like product strategy. Definitely not a technical, not an engineer, but it's been a really interesting experience just to see like how these products that people use in their everyday life get built.
That's pretty amazing and impressive that you started off, with Instagram. Pretty hard company to get in initially. To those, students or younger people out there who want to, jump into their first, company in tech and big tech and in general, what would be some ways that you would give them some advice to, how to navigate and leverage that into that space? Because most people, in their career, they don't get, to Instagram and, Meta, whatever you want to call it, until later on, in their lifetime, if they ever make it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely was appreciative of the opportunity to kind of start my career there. I think the way I went about it was just having a lot of internship experience, kind of like being open and trying to just like be a unique, memorable person. Like I always brought up in my interviews that I had traveled a lot and like been able to learn a lot, and I thought that that made me the type of person who is able to have a lot of empathy and be able to really understand how to build products that people all around the world use. So I guess like those were some of the things that maybe helped me stand out. But yeah, I think I've kind of evolved my opinion to now be like, I kind of want to get my hands dirty in like smaller companies, startups where you're just more building something from the ground up. But I've had an amazing experience working at Instagram. Like definitely would recommend working there.
Yeah, I mean, you've built a little bit of brand equity once you've gotten to Insta, and now you're into TikTok, and are you still in TikTok, or you're in a new company, or
Not at the moment, no.
now that you're not in TikTok anymore, Instagram, etc. You're in your ex Instagram, ex TikTok, but now you've talked about moving into more smaller startups. Why?
Yeah, I mean, I dabbled in like entrepreneurship myself last year a bit, was in the beginning stages of like putting together like a travel oriented like web platform that would pair up like travelers with travel experts, just like something I worked on as like a passion project. And I think that being in like a community of other entrepreneurs and just like seeing people who are really taking like ideas and making them into real full-fledged companies and systems and platforms just seems a lot more exciting to me than kind of like optimizing something that people already use. So for me, I think like I'm just really into like new learning experiences all the time. It's kind of like one of the reasons I travel a lot is like just love experiencing new things, learning a lot, being in different environments. So I think I'm the type of person who doesn't like to sit still or like stay in one place for too long. So I think for me, just looking for like a change of pace, change of scenery. And I think that startups are a great way to like get a ton of experience in a whole different realm compared to big tech.
Wow, that's interesting. Like originally, I started off into startups first, and then I went into big tech, and then now I'm at the point where it's just like, do I even really care about big tech anymore? Because I think when I joined big tech, I looked at it as like, how can I grow and learn, from bigger tech? Like, what were the different variances from a startup versus, a founder, being a founder, and then versus being, into these larger orgs? Like, what were the variances to scale? And so, what I was always looking at is like, I mean, there's a lot of social clout too as well. Once you're in Meta and LinkedIn and these type of companies, FANG typical type of companies, So you can use that to leverage yourself in mostly any company and be a power player. But it's like there's no, you're just building, or I would say you're adding wood to the already existing fire, right?
Yeah.
And it's funny that we say that people who build products at that level are grade A, right? And I remember when I was at Meta, it said like guys like Zuckerberg were like the top tier visionaries, and product people. And I was just like, what? I mean, of course we would say that. I mean, because he's paying us, right? Yeah. I mean, it's like some people were just lucky being founders. I'm not saying that they're not smart and intelligent, but some people got lucky. I have a bunch of friends
Lucky is such a big part of it, for sure.
Yeah, I had a bunch of friends who were just lucky. But then there's also a process and a strategy to it, to making big money as well. And a lot of entrepreneurs don't know it. There's a difference between being, a company who grows the size of Instagram and gets acquired versus being a company that is, just a startup that you got, some friends and family cash from. And now you've got a couple of investors involved who probably don't have this prominent name or association. You can't leverage off of that. So now you're at this point, you have this company. It's harder for you to raise capital. It's harder to acquire people because maybe you don't have the branding behind you to acquire the proper people and influence them, and also to get the proper investors to give you some little bit of, I don't know, some clout. You need some clout earlier on. If look at what was it, the Theranos lady. She got tons of money just off of clout. And it's like, I don't think people really understand how much that matters on the success rate of your company, if who you have in your network and how the branding and everything else is all thought out strategically could really matter. And I think we've been downplaying it for a while, saying, oh, branding, marketing, these user experiences don't really matter as much. It's really just, we're having this engineer mindset. You just got to have an engineer who knows how to build it, and that's all you need. And build it and they will come, and you just get some subscribers, B2B or B2C, and you've got a big business there and proof to concept, and you're good after that. But sometimes you can just build a small startup, right? A small business style startup, or it has a higher risk of actually failing. And I kind of believe, like, similar to that Peter Thiel 0 to 1 type of thing, is like, if you're going to go in, kind of go all the way and, knock that competition out, because competition isn't that great.
Yeah, it's true.
So I don't know. That's just kind of my take from it. But, now that you're on this initial journey, have you already started your startup now, or are you still or are you in a startup exactly? Or are you just exploring? Where are you at right now?
No, yeah. I mean, I've actually been focusing a lot on just reflecting and kind of figuring out what I want to do in my next steps in my career. Honestly, right now, I'm also doing a lot of work with my book. I'm doing a couple speaking engagements, taking it around to different schools. I'm doing book clubs and just trying to spread the word and get my ideas out there, because I think it was honestly a personal project for me to write and publish a collection of all my stories, but I am very interested in trying to get especially younger people to read it and to get exposed to the ideas and actually be able to make an impact through that work.
Yeah, that's I used to be in a lot of association with Eric Ries from Lean Startup. And so, I used to help him out with a lot of the media and stuff like that all the time with his book and things like that. And it's so funny, is because when he wrote that book, I felt like a lot of startups weren't following those principles, but then everyone started copying, pasting the same principles like it was their own. Every company starts saying, hey, we need to think agile, lean, we do things lean. And it's like, man, are we just copying, pasting different frameworks and best practices when somebody writes a book? So it's you could write this new book, and then, it gets popular. You go on to speaking engagements, and then now everybody's just regurgitating everything you said out of your book based off of chapters and references.
Yeah.
It's funny, right? And then you were working right beside them earlier, but now that you went off and did your own thing, now people are saying, oh, did you read, Caitlyn's book, such and such, And it's about finding yourself and traveling the world and going to 70 countries, Yeah, it's...
It's interesting. Yeah, ideas really do get bounced around, recycled quite a bit.
But I'm just saying, you might have not been such a major influence when you were a part of these large orgs, but once you've actually ventured off and start doing things on your own, now it's really comical because you could become like a voice for the industry when it comes to finding oneself and empathy and traveling. And now, oh yeah, have you read Caitlyn's book? It's about traveling. I need to do this now. So now it's this philosophy for people's lives. And it's just like comical that like you could have sat next to that person prior and told them the same thing. But until you actually got out there and actually promoted your book and your methodology and reasoning, now they're just like, oh yeah, that book is so great. I read it all the time. It's amazing. I got it on Amazon.
Yeah.
It's on my Kindle. I had it right next to my bed, It's like the Bible to me, But yeah, I don't know. But it's been great having you actually on the podcast. It's been a little great, fun conversation. I think we went and touched a bunch of fun and interesting things. I wanted to give you a chance to really, talk to everyone and tell them where they can pick out your book. I did read some of it. Definitely thought it was interesting, but I really wanted to get you on the podcast and really just kind of like have fun and just have that casual conversation and, let people learn about you and, my experiences, vice versa. And hopefully people can grow from that communication and conversation because we touched on some interesting things, I think. But where could they go get your book from?
Totally.
Where can they go look you up, follow you, get your book and things like that? How can they get in contact with you? Yeah.
Yeah, so the book is called You Are Where You Go, kind of like a traveler's take on You Are What You Eat. You can find it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, pretty much anywhere you generally pick up a book. And yeah, you can follow me on Instagram. The kind of account that I keep for the book is You Are Where You Go. And then my personal Instagram is Caitlyn Lubas. It's spelled CAITLYNLUBAS because there are like 5 million ways to spell Caitlyn. I always feel the need to spell it out.
Nah, there's a lot of new Caitlyns that came into the world that have kind of dominated your name. So it's like, it's kind of popular now these days, especially, yeah. But, yeah, everybody, definitely thanks for listening to the podcast and definitely go check out Caitlyn's book. I think it's really awesome. I don't really care if you're, a younger person or an older adult. I think it can be, useful for anybody's learning and journey. And one thing I also wanted to add is that it's actually a privilege almost to some point to even be able to travel the world. And it's not always such an expensive thing. I think a lot of people can actually figure out how to do it and figure out how they can hop from country and live off it and different type of hacks and ways. But what would be some key takeaways that you'd probably suggest for people who are, not balling on a budget to travel around the world, and to, see these things such as you if they really want to? What would you say for some last conversation on that?
Yeah, I really agree that it is not necessarily a financial barrier that keeps most people from traveling. I really think it's just not making it a priority. Like a lot of people tend to like wait around if they don't have like a friend to come with them, or if they just don't really want to put in the time and effort to research how to actually travel on a budget and like how to stay in hostels, how to make use of all these different budget ways or just like resourceful ways to travel. I think if you just make it a personal decision and a priority for yourself that you're like setting a goal that you want to travel and you're going to make it happen, you'll find a way to make it work. You'll find a way to save the money. You'll find a way to budget properly. You'll find a way to either muster up the courage and go solo and like meet people in hostels or like find some sort of group trip to do. It just, that first key step is deciding this is a priority for me. I'm going to work towards being able to travel more often. And you have to make that decision.
I couldn't disagree with you any much at all, but I think like people need to have people like you or me in their corner where they can actually leverage that information because knowledge is power. And typically, I think I was telling you previously before, is like a lot of people will say, people really don't realize how great they have it in America or wherever they may be. And it's like, hey, if you're probably don't have enough money to, put food on the table, you're probably not able to have that relative comparisons and travel and learn that you're really in a blessed place because to you, it's hell. It's relative to you, right? Because that's what all you see. So this is what it is. Most people around you have these nice things. You don't. So we're not thinking about traveling around the world, but there are ways to do it and to figure out how to get out of these circles and to change your life. And hopefully people will read your book and get inspired and do things that don't scale. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Hope the inspiration is out there.
Awesome. Well, thank you for being on the podcast. Just hang on for a second, Caitlyn. We're going to make sure everything uploads, and it's been amazing.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Ladies and gentlemen,
The Kids in the Room Podcast! Kids in the Room Podcast!
That's right. That's right.
Brought to you by Move Faces TV. Let's go!